The gunshot echoed across Sweetwater Valley like a clap of thunder, sending a flock of startled ravens into the azure Wyoming sky. Genevieve Winters didn't flinch not because she was accustomed to the sound, but because she couldn't afford to show fear, not here, not now, with 6 pairs of eyes watching her every move outside the general store. "Fine shot for a woman," drawled the saloon keeper, eyeing the tin can she'd just blasted off the fence post 30 yards away. "But that don't change what folks say about you, Miss Winters." The year was 1878, and the frontier town of Timberline wasn't known for its hospitality, especially toward women who rode alone and shot straighter than most men. Genevieve holstered her Colt with practiced ease, her emerald eyes betraying nothing of the weariness that had settled into her bones after 3 weeks of hard travel. "And what do they say, Mr. Hargrove?" she asked, though she already knew. The same things they'd said in Denver, in Santa Fe, in every dusty town she'd passed through since leaving St. Louis 2 years ago. "They say you bring trouble." The old man chewed thoughtfully on his tobacco. "Say any man who gets tangled up with you ends up 6 feet under or behind bars." Genevieve adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, shielding her face from both the sun and the scrutiny. At 26, she'd grown used to the whispers, the sideways glances, the warnings. Her copper hair was tied back in a practical braid, her riding clothes plain but well-maintained, offering no hint of the fortune she'd left behind or the heartache. "I don't recall asking any man to get tangled up with me," she replied coolly, gathering her purchases from the mercantile porch. The bolt of calico fabric, ammunition, coffee, and sugar would have to last until she reached her destination. "Just passing through?" asked the mercantile owner's wife, a plump woman who had remained silent until now, curiosity finally overcoming her caution. "Looking to buy land," Genevieve answered truthfully. "Somewhere quiet." This elicited a chorus of uncomfortable glances among the onlookers. Land meant staying, and staying meant trouble. Before anyone could advise her against such notions, the distant thunder of hooves drew everyone's attention to the main street. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of riders, and the townsfolk dispersed with remarkable speed, leaving Genevieve alone on the porch with her parcels. She recognized the uniform of the Wyoming Territorial Marshal on the lead rider and felt an all-too-familiar knot form in her stomach. Law meant questions, and questions inevitably led to her past. She was contemplating a swift departure when a second group of riders appeared from the opposite direction. Unlike the orderly approach of the marshal's party, these men rode hard and reckless, their horses lathered with sweat. At their head rode a tall figure on a midnight black stallion, his posture suggesting both authority and defiance. The marshal's party halted, creating a standoff in the center of Timberline's dusty main street. Genevieve stood frozen, unwilling to draw attention by moving but knowing she was witnessing the prelude to violence. The townspeople peered from windows and doorways, seasoned enough in frontier life to recognize danger. "Archer," bellowed the marshal, "this ends today." The man on the black stallion removed his hat, revealing a shock of sun-bronzed hair and a face too handsome for Genevieve's peace of mind. Even at this distance, she could make out the amused quirk of his lips. "Marshal Donovan," he called back, voice carrying easily across the distance. "Seems like you're a ways outside your jurisdiction." The marshal's face reddened visibly. "I've got papers that say otherwise. You're wanted for questioning about that business in Laramie." The rider Archer tilted his head as if considering this information. "Funny thing about questions," he replied. "A man's got the right not to answer them." The tension stretched between them like a bowstring pulled taut. Genevieve found herself holding her breath, acutely aware that she stood directly in the potential line of fire. She'd seen enough frontier justice to know how quickly situations like this could turn deadly. What happened next occurred with such speed that later, when she tried to piece it together, Genevieve could only recall fragments. A nervous deputy's hand moving too quickly to his holster, the crack of a gunshot, the black stallion rearing, and then chaos as both groups of men scattered for cover. She dove behind a water trough as bullets splintered wood and shattered glass around her. Drawing her Colt, she peered over the edge of the trough, searching for an escape route. Instead, she locked eyes with Archer, who had taken shelter behind a nearby wagon. His expression shifted from surprise to interest as he registered her presence, and the steady way she held her weapon. A bullet thudded into the trough inches from her head, sending water cascading over its rim. Instinctively, she fired back toward its source, her shot causing a deputy to duck with a startled yelp. "That's some shooting, madam," Archer called over the gunfire, sounding more impressed than frightened, "but you might want to reconsider your choice of allies." "I haven't chosen any allies," she retorted, ducking as another bullet whizzed overhead. A grin spread across his face, reckless, wolfish, utterly captivating. "Then perhaps it's time you did." Before she could respond, he fired 2 rapid shots toward the marshal's position, then darted toward her with surprising speed for a man of his size. Reaching her side, he pressed his back against the trough. "Elias Archer," he introduced himself casually, as if they were meeting at a social rather than in the middle of a gunfight. "And you are leaving," Genevieve replied firmly, eyes scanning for an opening. He laughed, a rich sound that seemed out of place amid the chaos. "That makes 2 of us. My men are creating a diversion on the east end of town. There's a trail through the cottonwoods that leads to the river." "I don't need your help," she insisted, even as another volley of shots made her position increasingly untenable. Elias Archer studied her face for a moment, taking in the determination in her eyes, the proud set of her jaw. "No, madam, I don't imagine you do, but I could use yours." He nodded toward the end of the street where 3 deputies were moving to cut off his escape route. Genevieve hesitated. Helping this man would mean choosing sides in a conflict she knew nothing about, potentially adding to the reputation that already haunted her. Yet something in his direct gaze, free from the leering evaluation she usually received from men, gave her pause. "They'll be watching for you," she said finally. "Not for me," understanding dawned in his eyes. "A distraction," she nodded tersely. "Get ready to run." Without waiting for his agreement, Genevieve holstered her weapon and stood, hands raised. "Don't shoot," she called out, stepping into view. "I'm just passing through." The deputies hesitated, rifles still raised but no longer firing. Using their moment of confusion, she began walking toward them with deliberate steps, her posture projecting helplessness and fear. "Please," she continued, voice pitched higher than normal. "I was just buying supplies when these outlaws arrived." Behind her, she sensed rather than heard Elias Archer slip away, moving low and fast toward the cottonwoods. The deputy's attention remained fixed on her, their expressions wavering between suspicion and concern. "Madam, get down," one ordered, gesturing with his rifle. "This is dangerous territory." She complied, dropping to her knees in the dust, creating an even more compelling distraction as the lawman moved toward her. From the corner of her eye, she saw Elias reach the tree line, pausing just long enough to tip his hat in her direction before disappearing into the foliage. The marshal approached, his weathered face creased with anger. "Where did he go?" he demanded, looming over her. Genevieve widened her eyes, adopting an expression of confusion she'd perfected years ago. "Who, sir? I was just trying to get away from the shooting." His eyes narrowed. "Archer, the man you were talking to behind that trough." "I wasn't talking to anyone," she lied smoothly. "I was hiding." Alone, the marshal studied her for a long moment, doubt evident in his gaze. Finally, he gestured to his deputies. "Check her belongings and her name." As the lawmen dispersed to follow orders, Genevieve maintained her facade of innocence, all while calculating her next move. Her supplies were still on the mercantile porch, and her horse was stabled at the livery. Even if she could retrieve them without arousing further suspicion, her interaction with Elias Archer had been witnessed. Word would spread, as it always did. She had just become exactly what the townsfolk feared: trouble. 2 hours later, after enduring the marshal's interrogation and retrieving her belongings under the watchful eyes of his deputies, Genevieve rode out of Timberline. The marshal hadn't been able to hold her. She'd committed no crime by his own witnesses' accounts, but his parting words echoed in her mind. "I don't know what your connection is to Archer, miss, but my advice, stay clear of him. That man's trouble with a capital T." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years hearing she was trouble for any man who crossed her path. Now she was being warned away from a man for the same reason. Genevieve followed the old trading road north, planning to put as much distance as possible between herself and timberline before nightfall. The land opened before her, vast and promising rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the valley. This was what had drawn her west: the freedom, the space, the possibility of building something that was truly hers. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she almost missed the movement in the trees ahead. Her mare sensed it first, ears pricking forward in alert curiosity rather than fear. Genevieve reined in, her hand moving instinctively to her sidearm. "I'd appreciate if you didn't shoot me, Miss Winters," called a familiar voice. "Especially after the trouble you went to helping me escape earlier." Elias Archer emerged from the shade of a massive cottonwood, leading his black stallion. Without the tension of the gunfight, she could properly assess him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that combined rugged experience with boyish charm. His clothes were quality, not flashy, but well-made, and he wore his guns with the ease of a man accustomed to their weight. "How do you know my name?" she demanded, keeping her hand near her holster. He smiled, the expression transforming his face from handsome to devastating. "Small towns talk and I listen. The mysterious Genevieve Winters, buying land and shooting cans off fence posts." "You made quite an impression in the 2 hours you were there." She didn't return his smile. "Are you following me, Mr. Archer?" "Not following exactly." He patted his stallion's neck, more like waiting. "This is the only road north for 20 miles, and I figured a woman looking to buy land would be heading toward the unclaimed parcels past Blackwater Creek." Her silence confirmed his guess. "I owe you a debt," he continued when she didn't speak. "Those deputies would have had me cornered if not for your distraction." "Consider it repaid by not shooting me just now," she replied dryly. "Now, if you'll excuse me." She made to ride past him, but he stepped forward, not quite blocking her path but making it clear he wasn't finished. "The land you're heading toward," he said, his tone more serious now. "It's good land, water, timber, grazing, but it's also contested." This caught her attention. "The land agent in Cheyenne said it was available for homesteading," Elias snorted. "Land agents in Cheyenne say a lot of things when they're collecting filing fees. Truth is, the Blackwater Range is caught between railroad interests, cattle barons, and what's left of the Shoshone hunting grounds, not to mention local ranchers who have been using it as open range for years." Genevieve frowned. She'd spent nearly all her remaining funds on the filing papers, convinced by the land agent's assurances that this parcel was her opportunity for a fresh start. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm one of those local ranchers," he answered candidly. "My spread, the AAA, borders what would be your property. And while I've got no quarrel with newcomers staking honest claims, I thought you should know what you're riding into." She studied him, trying to discern his true motives. Men didn't typically offer helpful advice to women traveling alone, at least, not without expecting something in return. "And that's the only reason you waited for me. Neighborly concern." His eyes, a striking shade of gray-blue she hadn't noticed during their brief encounter in town, crinkled at the corners. "That, and I was curious about the woman who outshot 3 deputies and then convinced them she was just an innocent bystander." Despite herself, Genevieve felt the corner of her mouth twitch. 4 deputies, she corrected. The young one behind the water barrel never even got a shot off. Elias laughed, the sound rich and genuine. 4 then, even more impressive, he sobered slightly, but my warning stands. "That land you're heading for, it's trouble waiting to happen." "I'm familiar with trouble, Mr. Archer, so I've heard." His expression grew thoughtful. "They say you bring it to any man who gets too close." She stiffened, defenses rising. "And what do you say?" The smile that spread across his face then was different from before, slower, more deliberate, with a gleam in his eyes that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "I say trouble's my middle name, Miss Winters." For a moment they regarded each other in silence, the air between them charged with something Genevieve couldn't quite name. Then Elias stepped back, giving her room to pass. "Triple is about 10 miles northwest of your parcel," he said. "White house with a red barn, can't miss it. If you find yourself in need of anything, supplies, information, or just coffee that isn't your own, brewing, my door's open." Genevieve nodded, unsure how to respond to such an open invitation. Part of her, the cautious, defensive part that had kept her alive these past years, warned against any entanglement. But another part, one she'd almost forgotten existed, was intrigued by this man who seemed neither intimidated by her reputation nor intent on exploiting it. "Safe travels, Miss Winters," he said, tipping his hat as she nudged her mare forward. "I expect we'll be seeing each other again." As she rode past, their eyes met one final time, and Genevieve had the distinct impression that Elias Archer saw more in her than most people ever bothered to look for. The thought was both unnerving and oddly comforting. "Perhaps," she allowed, then continued on her way, resisting the urge to look back, though she could feel his gaze following her long after she'd left him behind. The land opened up before Genevieve as she crested a gentle rise 2 days later, revealing a panorama that stole her breath. The evening light painted the valley in hues of gold and amber, illuminating a meandering creek that cut through meadows dotted with wildflowers. Beyond, a dense stand of pines climbed the lower slopes of distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the June warmth. According to her maps and the land agent's description, this was at her land. 160 acres of promise, of possibility, of permanence after years of drifting. She dismounted, letting her mare graze while she consulted the crude map one final time. The boundary markers should be visible stakes driven by the survey team who had parceled out this section of territory. After a few minutes of searching, she located the first one, a wooden post with metal numbers that matched her deed. "Well," she said aloud, her voice carrying across the empty landscape, "what do you think, Ruby?" The mare flicked an ear in her direction but continued grazing, apparently approving of their new home. Genevieve smiled, allowing herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Then, practical as always, she began assessing the site for a suitable location to make camp. The sun was sinking rapidly, and she needed shelter before nightfall. She chose a spot near the creek, beneath a sturdy cottonwood that would provide both shade and a windbreak. As she unsaddled Ruby and began unloading her supplies, movement on the distant ridge caught her eye. Riders, 3 of them silhouetted against the darkening sky. Instinct had her reaching for her rifle before she consciously registered the potential threat. She worked efficiently, hobbling Ruby and positioning her packs to form a makeshift barricade, all while keeping the approaching riders in her peripheral vision. They made no attempt to conceal their approach, riding directly toward her camp at an unhurried pace. By the time they were within hailing distance, Genevieve had her rifle resting across her knees, visible but not aimed, a warning rather than a threat. The lead rider raised his hand in greeting, then slowly removed his hat, revealing a weathered face beneath a shock of silver hair. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice carrying the distinctive drawl of a man who'd spent decades in the saddle. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "That depends on why you're here," Genevieve replied, not rising from her seated position on a fallen log. The old cowboy nodded as if her caution was both expected and approved. "Name's Hank Douglas. This here's my son Caleb and our hand, Miguel." He gestured to his companions, a younger version of himself and a Mexican man perhaps in his 30s. "We run cattle on the Bar D just over that western ridge." "Genevieve Winters," she introduced herself, noting how the son's eyes narrowed at her name. Word traveled fast even in open country. "Winters," the older man repeated thoughtfully. "You'd be the one who filed on this parcel then." "I am." Hank exchanged glances with his son, some unspoken communication passing between them. Miss Winters, I don't mean to seem unwelcoming, but there might be some things you should know about this land before you get too settled. Genevieve fought the urge to sigh. Clearly, Elias Archer's warning hadn't been exaggerated. Such as? Such as the fact that the Bar D has been grazing cattle through this valley for 15 years. Caleb Douglas cut in, his tone less diplomatic than his father's. Our water rights to that creek were established before the territorial government even started surveying these parts. The deed makes no mention of existing claims, Genevieve countered, keeping her voice level despite the frustration building in her chest. Everything she owned was invested in this land, all her hopes for the future. Paperwork has a way of overlooking realities out here, Miss Winters, Hank said, his tone apologetic but firm. I'm not saying you don't have legal right to build here. Homestead acts clear enough. But that creek's the lifeblood of our herd, especially in dry years. Genevieve considered this. She needed the water as much as they did, but perhaps there was room for compromise. I have no intention of blocking your access to the creek, Mr. Douglas. But I do intend to build here and work this land. Caleb leaned forward in his saddle. Alone, no disrespect, madam, but homesteading's hard enough for a family with strong backs. For a woman on her own, I'm stronger than I look, she interrupted, steel entering her voice. This wasn't the first time her capabilities had been questioned because of her gender, and she doubted it would be the last. To her surprise, Miguel spoke up, his accent mild but distinct. The lady shoots well. When the Douglases looked at him questioningly, he added, there was talk in Timberline. She outshot the marshal's deputies, they say. Hank's bushy eyebrows rose, and he studied Genevieve with new interest. That true? She neither confirmed nor denied it, simply holding his gaze steadily. After a moment, the old rancher nodded as if coming to a decision. Well, Miss Winters, seems like you're determined. I won't pretend I'm happy about having a homestead cutting through our grazing route, but I reckon there's room enough for all if we're civil about it. That's all I ask, she replied, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. We'll be moving a herd through here in about a week, Hank continued. I'll make sure the boys keep them from trampling wherever you decide to build. He hesitated, then added, if you need anything in the meantime, tools, supplies, an extra hand with heavy work, the Bar d'Itakes about 5 miles that way. He pointed west. Genevieve nodded, surprised and touched by the offer. Thank you, Mr. Douglas, I appreciate that. As the ranchers prepared to depart, Caleb lingered, his expression troubled. One more thing, Miss Winters. You might want to be careful about your associations around these parts. Word is you were seen with Elias Archer back in Timberline. She stiffened. Is that a problem? Father and son exchanged another glance. Depends on who you ask, Hank replied carefully. Archer's got his own way of doing things, not always in line with the law, but he's fair in his dealings, I'll give him that. Just complicated. I've only spoken to the man once, Genevieve said, choosing not to elaborate on the circumstances. Hardly what I'd call an association. Good, Caleb said firmly, because that's one neighbor whose trouble you don't need. With that parting advice, the 3 riders tipped their hats and departed, leaving Genevieve alone with her thoughts as darkness settled over her new land. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive that night. She lay in her bedroll, staring up at stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch, while her mind churned with the day's revelations. The land agent had conveniently omitted any mention of existing grazing rights or water disputes. And now she had not one but 2 neighboring ranchers with vested interests in her property, one of whom, apparently, had a reputation at least as problematic as her own. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west seeking a fresh start, a place where her past wouldn't matter and she could build something untainted by rumor or scandal. Instead, she'd landed squarely in the middle of what promised to be exactly the kind of entanglement she'd hoped to avoid. And yet, as she finally drifted towards sleep, it wasn't worry that dominated her thoughts, but curiosity. About this land and its possibilities, about the Douglases and their grudging acceptance. And most persistently, about a certain gray-eyed rancher who claimed trouble as his middle name. The first week on her homestead passed in a blur of exhausting, ceaseless labor. Genevieve had known the work would be demanding, but the reality tested even her considerable determination. Each morning she rose before dawn, tending to Ruby before beginning the day's tasks. Clearing the building site, cutting sod for a temporary shelter, digging a fire pit, hunting for fresh meat to supplement her dwindling supplies. By the seventh day, her hands were blistered despite her gloves, her muscles ached constantly, and she'd made less progress than she'd hoped. The foundation for her cabin was laid out, but actual construction remained a daunting prospect for a single pair of hands. Still, she refused to be discouraged. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither would her homestead be. She was returning from the creek with filled water buckets when the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached her ears. Setting the buckets down, she moved to where she could retrieve her rifle if necessary, then waited as the lone rider came into view. The black stallion was recognizable even at a distance. Elias Archer sat tall in the saddle, his form silhouetted against the morning sky as he guided his mount down the slope toward her camp. He carried what appeared to be a burlap sack across his saddle horn, and a coil of rope hung from his pommel. "Good morning, Miss Winters," he called as he drew near. "I see you found your property without difficulty." Genevieve relaxed slightly, though she remained wary. "Mr. Archer, what brings you to my land?" He swung down from his horse with easy grace, landing lightly despite his size. "Neighborly concern," he replied, eyes twinkling, "and curiosity about how you're faring." She gestured around at her modest campsite with its half-dug fire pit and stacked stones that would eventually form a chimney. "As you can see, I'm making progress." Elias surveyed her work with a practiced eye, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. "Indeed you are. Though I notice you're building closer to the creek than might be wise come spring thaw," Genevieve frowned, looking at her carefully chosen site. "The land agent assured me this elevation was safe from flooding." "Land agents," Elias said with a shake of his head. "Last April, everything within 50 yards of that creek was underwater. You'd do better building up on that small rise." He pointed to a gentle knoll about 100 yards back from her current site. She followed his gaze, frustration welling in her chest. If he was right, she'd wasted days of backbreaking work on a site that would be destroyed with the first heavy rain. As if reading her thoughts, Elias added gently, "Foundation stones move easier than finished walls." Genevieve sighed, pushing a stray lock of copper hair from her forehead. "I suppose I should be grateful for the advice, even if it means starting over." "Not entirely over," he countered. "And as it happens, I brought something that might help speed the process." He retrieved the burlap sack from his saddle and held it out to her. "Consider it a housewarming gift." Cautiously, she took the sack, surprised by its weight. Opening it revealed a set of tools: a proper hammer, a handsaw with sharp teeth, a level, and several other implements that would make her building work significantly easier. "Mr. Archer, I can't accept these," she said, though her fingers tightened involuntarily around the hammer's solid handle. "You can and you will," he replied firmly. "They're extras from my ranch, gathering dust in the tool shed. Besides, I have a vested interest in seeing this homestead succeed." She raised an eyebrow at this. "Oh, and what interest is that? As I mentioned before, my ranch borders your property." "Good neighbors make for peaceful boundaries." His smile turned wry. "And despite what the Douglases might have told you, I prefer peace when possible." So he knew about her encounter with the other ranchers. Genevieve wasn't surprised news traveled fast in sparsely populated territory, but she was curious about the apparent tension between the neighboring spreads. "They did mention you," she admitted, though they were somewhat vague about the details. Elias laughed, the sound warming the cool morning air. "I'll bet they were. Old Hank Douglas has been calling me a troublemaker since I bought the triple 5 years ago. Mostly because I refused to follow the traditional range boundaries, which conveniently favored the Bar D." "And is that why the marshal was so eager to question you in Timberline?" His expression sobered. "No, that's a different matter entirely." He seemed about to elaborate, then changed course. "But that's a story for another time. Right now, I'd like to help you move those foundation stones if you're amenable." Genevieve hesitated, weighing her options. She needed the help that was undeniable. Even with better tools, building a cabin alone would take months she couldn't afford with winter eventually coming. But accepting assistance created an obligation, and obligations could be dangerous, especially to a man whose reputation rivaled her own for bringing trouble. As if sensing her internal debate, Elias added, "No strings attached, Miss Winters. Consider it enlightened self-interest. I'd prefer not to have to fish my neighbor out of a flooded cabin come springtime." That startled a laugh from her. "When you put it that way, Mr. Archer, I'd be a fool to refuse." "Elias," he corrected, removing his coat and rolling up his shirt sleeves to reveal muscular forearms tanned by the sun. "If we're to be neighbors, we might as well dispense with formalities." She watched as he assessed the foundation stones, already calculating the most efficient way to move them. His confidence was evident but not overbearing, his movements purposeful and assured. "Very well," she conceded. "Elias it is, and you may call me Genevieve." He glanced up, the morning sun catching in his eyes and turning them the color of a summer sky. "Genevieve," he repeated, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue. "It suits you." She wasn't quite sure how to respond to that, so she simply picked up a shovel and moved to join him at the foundation line. "Shall we begin?" Together, they worked through the morning, relocating the stones to the higher ground Elias had suggested. What would have taken her days alone was accomplished in hours with his help. More than his strength, Genevieve appreciated his approach to the task. He worked alongside her rather than taking over, offering suggestions rather than commands, treating her as a capable partner rather than a helpless female. By midday, the new foundation was marked out, larger and more precisely squared than her original attempt. They paused to rest in the shade of the cottonwood, sharing water from Genevieve's canteen and jerky from Elias's saddlebag. "You've done this before," she observed, noting how he'd naturally incorporated features she hadn't considered, like proper drainage channels and a root cellar location. "Built my first cabin when I was 19, he confirmed. "Up in Montana Territory. It was a sorry excuse for a shelter leaked like a sieve and nearly collapsed in the first heavy snow, but I learned from my mistakes." "And now you have the AAA, she prompted, curious about his path. A shadow crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "Now I have the AAA, he agreed, though not without cost." Before she could ask what he meant, the distant sound of lowing cattle reached them on the breeze. Elias rose, shading his eyes as he looked westward. "That'll be Hank's herd moving through," he said. "Right on schedule." Genevieve stood as well, watching as the dust cloud on the horizon gradually resolved into the shapes of cattle and mounted cowboys. "He mentioned they'd be coming this way." "Did he mention they'd be cutting directly through where you're building?" Elias asked, his tone carefully neutral. She frowned. "No, but he promised they'd avoid my building site. And so they shall your new one, but your original site happens to sit right in the middle of what the Bar D considers their traditional drive path." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Understanding dawned, and with it a flash of anger. "You think they waited until I'd started building, knowing I'd have to move anyway when the herd came through?" Elias shrugged. "I wouldn't put it past Caleb, though Hank's generally more straightforward. Either way, it appears my neighborly advice saved you more trouble than just spring flooding." Genevieve wasn't sure whether to be grateful or resentful. On one hand, Elias had indeed saved her considerable work and potential conflict with the Douglases. On the other, she disliked feeling manipulated by either party in what was clearly an established feud. "This land is more complicated than I anticipated," she said finally. Elias's laugh held little humor. "Welcome to Wyoming Territory, Genevieve. Nothing here is as simple as it seems, least of all the land." He nodded toward the approaching herd. "I should go. Hank's boys get nervous when I'm around their cattle." "Why is that?" His smile returned, sharp-edged and a little dangerous. "Because I've been known to question which brand belongs on which cow, makes for uncomfortable encounters." "Are you saying they're rustlers?" she asked, keeping her voice low though the herd was still too distant for anyone to overhear. "I'm saying cattle have a way of wandering, and brands have a way of changing if a man's inclined to help them along." He gathered his coat and prepared to depart. "Just keep your eyes open, neighbor, and count your livestock regularly once you have some." Genevieve walked with him to where his stallion waited patiently. "Thank you for your help today," she said, genuinely grateful despite her lingering reservations. "And for the tools." Elias swung into the saddle with practiced ease. "My pleasure. I'll check back in a few days, see how you're progressing." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you'd prefer I didn't." She considered this, weighing the practical benefits of his assistance against the potential complications his presence might create. In the end, practicality won out. "I would welcome your advice," she said carefully, "though I don't want to impose on your time." His smile broadened, reaching his eyes and transforming his face in a way that made something flutter in her chest. "Trust me, Genevieve, spending time here is no imposition." With that, he tipped his hat and rode away, taking a route that would avoid encountering the approaching cattle drive. Genevieve watched him go, trying to ignore the fact that her pulse had quickened at his parting words. She turned back to face the oncoming herd, straightening her shoulders and preparing to establish clear boundaries with her other neighbors. As she did, she couldn't help but reflect on the irony. She'd come to Wyoming seeking isolation and independence, yet here she was, already entangled in the complex web of relationships that define this remote corner of the territory. And the most intriguing strand in that web was undoubtedly Elias Archer, a man who, if rumors were to be believed, brought as much trouble to those around him as she supposedly did. The difference was, he seemed to embrace that reputation while she had spent years trying to escape hers. As the first riders of the cattle drive came into view, Genevieve wondered which approach would ultimately prove more successful in this untamed land where reputations and realities seldom aligned. The cattle drive proved less confrontational than Genevieve had anticipated. Hank Douglas tipped his hat respectfully when he spotted her standing near her new building site, even riding over to exchange brief pleasantries. If he noticed the relocated foundation or recognized Elias's handiwork in the improved layout, he made no mention of it. Caleb, however, was less diplomatic. His eyes narrowed when he saw the tools Elias had left easily identifiable to anyone familiar with the triple, by the distinctive brand burned into their wooden handles. "Seems you've found yourself a helpful neighbor," he remarked, voice tight with disapproval. "Mr. Archer was kind enough to advise me on a better building location," Genevieve replied evenly. "Given the proximity to the creek." Hank shot his son a warning glance. "Good advice, that. Spring floods can be treacherous." He paused, then added with careful neutrality, "Though you might consider seeking multiple perspectives before making decisions about your property, Miss Winters. Folks around here have varying interests." "I appreciate the concern," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm, "but I'm accustomed to making my own judgments." The old rancher nodded, seeming to respect her stance even if he didn't entirely approve. "Fair enough. We'll keep the herd clear of your new site. Should pass through within a day or so." After they rode on, Genevieve returned to her work with renewed determination. Whatever tensions existed between her neighbors, she refused to be drawn into taking sides based solely on their mutual suspicions. She would form her own opinions through direct experience, a philosophy that had served her well in her travels. Over the next 3 weeks, a pattern emerged. Elias would appear every few days, always bringing something useful lumber salvaged from an old outbuilding on his property, a window frame he'd had lying around, once even a young milk cow that he claimed was surplus to requirements at the AAA. Each time, he would work alongside her for several hours, his assistance instrumental in transforming the foundation into walls, the walls into the beginnings of a proper cabin. Between his visits, Genevieve worked from dawn till dusk, pushing through exhaustion and occasional setbacks with stubborn perseverance. The Douglases, too, made appearances usually Hank or Miguel rather than Caleb, offering more limited help but useful local knowledge about weather patterns, wildlife concerns, and the best hunting grounds. Throughout these interactions, she maintained a careful neutrality, accepting assistance without allowing herself to become beholden to either ranch. Yet she couldn't deny that Elias's visits had become the bright points in her grueling routine, not just for the practical help he provided, but for his companionship. He was easy to talk to, quick to laugh, and possessed a surprising depth of knowledge on everything from carpentry to literature. During their breaks, their conversations ranged widely, though both tacitly avoided certain topics. Her past before coming west, his conflict with the marshal, the specific nature of the trouble that supposedly followed them both. On a particularly hot afternoon in early July, they sat in the partial shade of the cabin's newly raised walls, sharing a meal of rabbit stew Genevieve had prepared over her fire pit. The roof was next on their agenda, a challenging task that would require both of them working in precarious positions under the blazing summer sun. "We should wait until evening," Elias suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. "Heat like this makes for poor decision-making, and roofing leaves little margin for error." Genevieve nodded her agreement, secretly relieved at the prospect of a brief respite. "What shall we do in the meantime? There's still several hours of daylight." He considered this, his gaze traveling past her to the creek that wound through her property. "When was the last time you did something purely for pleasure, Genevieve?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean," he said, rising and offering his hand to help her up, "when did you last do something that wasn't about survival or building or proving yourself capable?" She allowed him to pull her to her feet, acutely aware of the strength in his calloused grip and the warmth that seemed to linger even after he released her hand. "It's been a while," she admitted. "Then it's long overdue." He nodded toward the creek. That bend downstream forms a perfect swimming hole. Deep, clear, and cool even in this heat. Genevieve felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Swimming? I couldn't possibly, why not?" His eyes held a challenge, but his smile remained gentle. "No one for miles to see, and God knows we both could use the wash." She bristled slightly at that last comment, though she knew it to be true. Bathing had been a hasty affair since her arrival, limited to quick sponge baths with creek water carried back to camp. "I don't have appropriate attire," she protested, though the idea of cool water against her skin was increasingly tempting as sweat trickled down her back. Elias laughed. "Neither do I, but I reckon our undergarments cover more than those fancy bathing costumes they wear back east." When she still hesitated, he added, "I'll go downstream a ways, give you privacy. Just thought you might appreciate the suggestion." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked toward the creek, whistling a jaunty tune as if he'd suggested nothing more controversial than a stroll. Genevieve watched him go, torn between propriety and the undeniable appeal of his suggestion. After a week of back-breaking labor in unrelenting heat, the thought of immersing herself in cool water was almost irresistible. "This is madness," she muttered to herself, even as she gathered a clean shirt and trousers from her dwindling supplies. Yet there was something liberating about the idea, a small rebellion against the constraints that had governed her life for so long, even here in the supposed freedom of the frontier. Decision made, she followed the path to the creek, veering upstream from the direction Elias had taken. At a bend where the water pooled deep and clear, sheltered by willows, she paused to ensure she was truly alone. Satisfied with her privacy, she quickly shed her dusty work clothes, leaving only her modest camisole and drawers, then waded cautiously into the water. The shock of coolness against her heated skin drew a gasp of pleasure. She moved deeper until the water reached her waist, then impulsively ducked beneath the surface, emerging with a breathless laugh. It felt glorious, the weightlessness, the cleansing flow against her skin, the sudden absence of the ever-present dust and sweat. For several minutes, she simply enjoyed the sensation, floating on her back and watching clouds drift across the endless blue sky through a frame of willow branches. The constant tension she'd carried since arriving, perhaps even years before that, seemed to dissolve in the gentle current. She was so absorbed in this rare moment of peace that she didn't immediately register the approaching footsteps. When she did, she quickly moved to deeper water, ensuring she was decently covered. "Elias," she called, expecting his voice to respond from a discreet distance. Instead, an unfamiliar male voice answered. "Well now, what have we here?" Two men emerged from the willows, strangers, their expressions causing Genevieve's momentary tranquility to vanish in an instant. They were trail rough and unshaven, their clothes bearing the dust of long travel, and the way they looked at her sent ice through her veins despite the warm air. "Didn't expect to find such a pretty sight out here in the wilderness," said the taller one, his smile revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "You all alone, miss?" Genevieve calculated her options rapidly. Her rifle was back at the cabin, her pistol with her clothes on the bank. The men stood between her and her weapons, between her and escape. "I'm not alone," she replied firmly, working to keep her voice steady. "My husband is just upstream." The men exchanged skeptical glances. "Funny," said the shorter, stockier man. "We been riding along this creek for a spell and ain't seen hide nor hair of nobody 'cept you." "Then you weren't looking carefully enough," came Elias's voice, cold and hard as steel. Relief flooded through Genevieve as he appeared behind the men, his revolver drawn and aimed with unwavering precision. She hadn't heard his approach clearly, neither had the intruders, who stiffened at the sound of a gun being cocked. "Now, gentlemen," Elias continued, his casual tone belied by the dangerous glint in his eyes, "I suggest you turn around very slowly, keeping your hands where I can see them." The men complied, raising their hands as they turned to face this new threat. Recognition dawned on the taller man's face. "Archer," he spat, "should have known this was triple a land." "Actually," Elias corrected, "you're trespassing on Miss Winters' property, but that's the least of your concerns right now." He nodded toward the path. "Start walking, back the way you came." "We was just being friendly," the stocky man protested. "Didn't mean no harm." "Your definition of friendly doesn't align with mine." Elias's voice had dropped to a near growl. "Walk, now, and if I see either of you within 10 miles of this place again, you won't get a warning." Something in his tone, or perhaps the utterly convincing way he held his weapon, persuaded the men not to argue further. They backed away slowly, then turned and hurried up the path, casting occasional glances over their shoulders until they disappeared into the brush. Only when the sound of their retreat had faded did Elias lower his gun, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He kept his back to the creek, giving Genevieve privacy. "Are you all right?" he called, concern evident in his voice. "Yes," she answered, though her heart was still racing. "Thanks to your timely arrival, I heard voices," he explained. "Recognized the type. Wade and Simmons drifters who pick up work with the cattle drives but mostly make their living through less respectable means." Genevieve waded to where her clothes lay, quickly drying herself and dressing behind the screen of willows. "You know them. Run into their kind before," Elias replied vaguely. "They won't bother you again, but you might want to keep that rifle closer at hand for a while." Once fully dressed, she emerged from the willows. Elias turned to face her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else, a protectiveness that should have rankled her independent nature, but instead stirred a complicated warmth in her chest. "I shouldn't have suggested swimming," he said, regret evident in his voice. "It was irresponsible of me. You couldn't have known those men would come along," she countered. "And until they appeared it was wonderful," she offered a small smile, "worth the interruption, I think." His answering smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nevertheless, I'm sorry for putting you in that position." He holstered his revolver with a practiced motion. "We should head back to the cabin. Those two might have friends nearby." They walked in silence for a few minutes, the easy companionship of earlier replaced by a new tension. Genevieve sensed Elias berating himself for what he perceived as a failure to protect her, a notion that both touched and troubled her. "I've encountered worse men than those two," she said finally. "Long before I met you." Elias glanced at her, curiosity warring with respect for her privacy. Is that what brought you west, running from something or someone? The question hovered between them, the first direct inquiry either had made about the other's past. Genevieve considered deflecting, as she had whenever the subject arose in their previous conversations, but something perhaps the intimacy created by shared danger made her answer honestly. Not running, exactly, more like seeking a place where what happened before doesn't define me. She paused, then added quietly, where rumors don't precede me into every room. Elias nodded, understanding evident in his expression. Rumors have a way of taking on a life of their own out here. People need stories to make sense of things and people that don't fit neatly into their expectations. Like a woman homesteading alone, Genevieve suggested, or a rancher who doesn't abide by the unwritten rules of the territory, he countered with a wry smile. They had reached the cabin, and Elias moved to check the surrounding area while Genevieve retrieved her rifle, comforted by its familiar weight in her hands. When he returned, satisfied they were alone, she offered him coffee, which he accepted with gratitude. As they sat on the rough-hewn bench outside the cabin's entrance, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the cottonwoods, Genevieve found herself wanting to continue their conversation to understand more about this man who seemed simultaneously forthright and mysterious. "The marshal in Timberline," she began cautiously. "What did he want with you?" Elias stared into his coffee cup for a long moment, as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed. "There was trouble in Laramie last winter. A cattle baron named Harrison Blake was found dead in his office." Shot through the heart at close range, Genevieve waited, sensing there was more to the story. "Blake was a powerful man," Elias continued, "the kind who thought money could buy anything: land, law, lives. He'd been squeezing small ranchers out of the territory for years, sometimes through legal means, sometimes not." "And they think you killed him?" Genevieve asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Elias met her gaze directly. "I had reason to. Blake's men burned out 3 homesteads that bordered my ranch last fall. Families who'd refused to sell to him. One of those families included a 6-year-old boy who didn't make it out of the fire." Horror and sympathy washed through Genevieve in equal measure. "That's terrible." "But surely if it was Blake's men, no proof," Elias interrupted bitterly. "Never is with men like Blake. They hire the work done, maintain their distance, claim ignorance if questioned." He took a long drink of coffee before continuing. 2 days after the funerals, Blake was found dead. And given our very public disagreements over land rights, plus the fact that I was in Laramie that night, you became the primary suspect," Genevieve finished for him. He nodded. "The marshal doesn't have enough evidence for an arrest because I didn't do it, but he's determined to keep looking until he finds something, or manufactures it." Genevieve absorbed this information, turning it over in her mind. If Elias was telling the truth, and something in her believed he was, then his reputation for trouble stemmed from standing against corruption and violence, not perpetrating it. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply, his expression softened. "Thank you for asking." Most people prefer to speculate from a distance. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across her property. Elias stood, setting aside his empty cup. "We lost the light for roofing today, but I can return tomorrow if that suits you." "I'd like that," Genevieve replied, surprised by how much she meant it. As he prepared to depart, gathering his hat and gloves, he paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Genevieve," he said, his voice low and serious, "the rumors about you bringing trouble to men, I'm beginning to think they have it backwards." "How so?" she asked, genuinely curious. His smile returned, warm and genuine. "Maybe it's not that you bring trouble to men who get close to you. Maybe it's that you have the courage to face trouble that already exists, and some men can't handle that kind of honesty." With those words hanging in the air between them, he mounted his stallion and rode away, leaving Genevieve to wonder if anyone had ever seen her so clearly before, or if she had finally found someone whose definition of trouble aligned with her own. The roof was completed by mid-July, a significant milestone that transformed the structure from a collection of walls into a genuine shelter. Standing inside her cabin for the first time with a solid barrier between herself and the open sky, Genevieve experienced a surge of pride and accomplishment unlike anything she'd felt before. This was hers, built with her own hands and Elias's, she acknowledged silently, a tangible manifestation of her determination to create a new life. The interior remained rough and unfinished, but the essentials were in place. A stone fireplace with a sturdy chimney, a bed frame awaiting the arrival of a proper mattress, shelves for provisions, and a table with 2 chairs, the latter an unexpected gift delivered by Miguel from the Bar D, carved by Hank Douglas himself as a housewarming present. The gesture had surprised her, particularly given the continuing tension between the 2 neighboring ranches. When she'd mentioned the gift to Elias, his only response had been a thoughtful nod and the comment, "Hank's a better man than his circumstances sometimes allow him to be." As July gave way to August, Genevieve settled into a routine that, while still demanding, no longer required the desperate dawn to dusk labor of the early weeks. With a secure shelter established, she turned her attention to the future, planting a small garden, tending to her growing collection of livestock. The milk cow had been joined by 2 goats, a half-dozen chickens, and a pair of pigs, and exploring the boundaries of her property. Elias's visits continued, though their nature evolved from purely practical assistance to something more social. He would appear every few days, sometimes bringing supplies or news from timberline, other times simply offering companionship. They would work on ongoing projects together, building furniture, improving the corral, planning for winter, their collaborative rhythm now so natural it required little discussion. The shift in their relationship was subtle but undeniable. Conversations flowed more freely. Silences felt comfortable rather than cautious, and they had begun to share stories from their pasts, Elias speaking of his years in Montana, Genevieve revealing carefully selected tales from her life in St. Louis. She found herself looking forward to his arrivals with an anticipation that both excited and alarmed her. Excited because she genuinely enjoyed his company, alarmed because she had sworn never again to allow her happiness to depend on another person's presence. On a particularly fine August evening, they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Elias had brought a bottle of surprisingly good whiskey to celebrate the completion of the root cellar, and they shared it in comfortable silence as the day's heat gradually yielded to the cool of approaching night. "I received a letter from the land office today," Genevieve said, breaking the contemplative quiet. "They've scheduled the final inspection for early October. If all is in order, the claim will be officially recognized." Elias raised his tin cup in a toast. "To official recognition, then." "Though in my eyes you've more than earned this land already," she smiled, warmed as much by his words as by the whiskey. "There were moments I wasn't sure I'd manage it." "I never doubted," he replied simply. Their eyes met over the rims of their cups, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of feelings that had been building gradually over the weeks of shared work and conversation. Genevieve looked away first, uncertain how to navigate this new territory. Elias seemed to sense her hesitation. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the distant mountains. "There's a gathering next week at the Johnson place about 15 miles east, a barn raising followed by a proper social, music, dancing, food enough to feed an army." "I've heard about it," Genevieve acknowledged. Hank had mentioned it during his last visit, though he hadn't explicitly invited her. "I thought perhaps you might consider attending," Elias continued, his tone carefully casual, "as my guest." The invitation hung between them, its implications clear. This wouldn't be neighbors helping neighbors or friends sharing a task. This would be a courtship gesture, public and deliberate. Genevieve took a slow sip of whiskey, using the moment to gather her thoughts. Part of her wanted to accept immediately the part that had come to look forward to his visits, that found his laugh increasingly necessary to her happiness, that admired not just his strength but his principles. But another part, the cautious, scarred part, reminded her of the risk involved for both of them. "People talk, Elias," she said finally. They already do about both of us separately. Together we'd be the scandal of the territory, he suggested, his smile taking any sting from the words. Despite herself, she laughed. Something like that. Let them talk, he said, his voice dropping to that low, serious tone that never failed to send a shiver down her spine. They will, regardless of what we do or don't do, might as well give them something worth talking about. Before she could respond, a distant sound caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching at speed. They both tensed, memories of the creek encounter still fresh. Elias stood, hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. The rider emerged from the gathering dusk, Miguel from the Bar D, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Miss Winters," he called, drawing his mount to a halt before the cabin. "Mr. Archer." If he was surprised to find Elias there, he didn't show it. "There is trouble." "Mr. Douglas sent me to warn you both." Genevieve rose, alarm replacing the warm contentment of moments before. "What kind of trouble?" Marshal Donovan, Miguel answered, his expression grim. "He is at the Bar D now with deputies and papers, search papers for the triple and this homestead." Elias's face hardened. "What's he claiming to search for?" "Stolen cattle," Miguel replied, "and evidence about the Blake killing. He says he has a witness now, someone who places you in Blake's office the night he died." Genevieve looked at Elias, whose expression had grown distant, calculating. "Is there any truth to it?" she asked quietly. "The witness," his eyes met hers clear and direct. "I was in Blake's office that night," he admitted, "to confront him about the homestead burnings, but he was alive when I left, angry, threatening, but very much alive." She believed him, she realized. Despite the warnings, despite his own admission that he'd had motive and opportunity, she trusted that Elias Archer was not a murderer. "How long until they reach here?" Elias asked Miguel. "An hour, perhaps less," the cowhand replied. "They are searching the Bar D thoroughly first. Mr. Douglas is delaying them as much as possible." This unexpected alliance between the feuding ranchers surprised Genevieve. Why would Hank help Elias? Miguel's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Douglas says a false accusation against one rancher threatens all ranchers. And—" He hesitated, glancing at Elias. "He says he owes you a debt from last winter." Elias nodded, some unspoken understanding passing between the men. "Thank him for me. Now you should head back before they notice you're gone." After Miguel departed, Elias turned to Genevieve, his expression grave. "I need to go. My presence here will only complicate things for you." "What will you do?" she asked, hating the fear that crept into her voice. "If they have a witness, even a false one, I have friends in the territory," he said, gathering his belongings with swift efficiency. "Places I can lie low until I figure out who's behind this. Blake had enemies besides me." The reality of what was happening struck Genevieve with sudden force. Elias was leaving, running from the law, and there was no telling when or if he would return. The thought created a physical ache in her chest. "The marshal will question you," Elias continued, practical despite the urgency. "About me, about us, you can truthfully say you know nothing about the Blake case." He paused, his gaze softening as it met hers. "I'm sorry to bring this to your doorstep, Genevieve. This is exactly what you were trying to avoid by coming here." "Don't," she said firmly, stepping closer to him. "Don't apologize for something that isn't your fault." He smiled sadly, reaching out to touch her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. "There's that courage I mentioned, facing trouble head-on." Without giving herself time to reconsider, Genevieve closed the remaining distance between them and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, but heartfelt, conveying what words couldn't in the limited time they had. When they parted, Elias looked momentarily stunned, then broke into a grin that transformed his face. "If that's the reward for bringing trouble to your door, I might have to do it more often." She laughed despite the gravity of the situation. "Go," she urged, though every part of her wanted him to stay. "Be careful." He mounted his stallion, then paused, looking back at her with an intensity that imprinted itself on her memory. "About the social at the Johnsons'," he said. "Save me a dance." Before she could answer, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness with the same suddenness that had characterized his first appearance in her life. Genevieve stood watching long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded. her mind racing with worry for his safety and the dawning realization of just how much Elias Archer had come to mean to her. The marshal and his deputies arrived precisely as Miguel had predicted, their approach heralded by the cloud of dust raised by multiple horses. Genevieve met them outside her cabin, composed and prepared. She had used the intervening time to ensure nothing of Elias's remained visible, though she doubted the lawmen would recognize his possessions even if they saw them. Marshal Donovan was a tall, gaunt man with hard eyes and a drooping mustache that failed to conceal the permanent downward turn of his mouth. He dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle, his expression making it clear he considered this duty unpleasant but necessary. "Miss Winters," he greeted her with a curt nod. "I have a warrant to search these premises for stolen livestock and evidence related to the murder of Harrison Blake." Genevieve accepted the paper he thrust toward her, scanning its contents with careful attention. The document appeared legitimate, signed by a territorial judge she'd heard mentioned in Timberline. "I'm happy to cooperate, Marshal," she said, handing back the warrant, "though I'm not sure what you expect to find here. I arrived in the territory months after Mr. Blake's death, and as you can see, my livestock is rather limited." Donovan's eyes narrowed slightly. "We're looking for evidence of your association with Elias Archer, madam. It's been reported that he's a frequent visitor to this homestead." She didn't bother denying it. "Mr. Archer has been kind enough to assist me with building my cabin, as have several other neighbors. I believe that's standard practice in these parts." "Kindness isn't what Archer is known for," one of the deputies muttered, earning a sharp glance from the marshal. "When did you last see him?" Donovan asked. 3 days ago," Genevieve lied smoothly. "He brought some nails for the chicken coop I'm building." The marshal studied her face, clearly searching for signs of deception. "And he made no mention of leaving the territory, no indication he was worried about the law catching up to him." She met his gaze steadily. "No, Marshal, he seemed perfectly at ease. Is there a reason he shouldn't be?" Donovan's mouth tightened beneath his mustache. "We have a witness who places Archer at the scene of Blake's murder, Miss Winters, a credible witness who's prepared to testify under oath." "That must be convenient for you," Genevieve remarked, unable to entirely hide her skepticism. After months of searching without success, the comment earned her a cold stare from the marshal. "I'll thank you to remember that obstruction of justice is a serious offense, madam. Now, if you'll step aside, we'll conduct our search and be on our way." For the next hour, Genevieve watched as the lawmen methodically examined her cabin, outbuildings, and livestock. They were thorough but not destructive, and she had to admit that Donovan, whatever his flaws, maintained professional discipline among his deputies. As expected, they found nothing incriminating. No stolen cattle, no evidence related to Blake's murder, no sign of Elias's recent presence. When they had finished, Donovan approached her again, frustration evident in the tight lines around his eyes. "He's been here more recently than 3 days ago," he stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Genevieve raised an eyebrow. "Is that an accusation, Marshal?" he sighed, suddenly looking tired rather than intimidating. "Just an observation, Miss Winters. We found fresh tracks leading north from your property. 2 horses, one with a distinctive shoe pattern known to belong to Archer's stallion." She said nothing, maintaining a neutral expression despite her internal alarm at this detail. "I don't know what Archer's told you about the Blake case," Donovan continued, "but a man like that, he doesn't form attachments out of the goodness of his heart. He uses people, especially those who don't know his history." "And you know his history," Genevieve countered, keeping her voice level. The marshal's expression darkened. "Better than most. Archer wasn't always a respectable rancher, Miss Winters. Before the AAA, he rode with some rough company, did jobs that required a fast gun and few questions." He paused, watching for her reaction. "The kind of jobs that might include removing a problem like Harrison Blake for the right price." Genevieve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Could it be true? Had Elias concealed a darker past from her? The doubt must have shown on her face because Donovan pressed his advantage. Ask yourself why a successful rancher would take such an interest in a lone woman's homestead, he suggested. Why he'd spend so much time here when he has his own spread to manage. What's he really after, Miss Winters? The insinuation stung, partly because it echoed questions Genevieve had asked herself in quieter moments. Why had Elias been so helpful, so persistent in his attention to her and her property? But then she remembered the genuine respect in his eyes when he spoke to her. The way he worked alongside her as an equal, his candor about the Blake case, even knowing it might change her opinion of him. None of that aligned with the calculating opportunist Donovan described. "I believe I can judge a man's character for myself, Marshal," she said coolly. "Now, if you've concluded your search, I have evening chores to complete before dark." Donovan studied her for a moment longer, then nodded curtly. "We'll be moving on, but this matter isn't closed, Miss Winters. When we apprehend Archer, and anyone who's aided him will face consequences." "I understand the law, Marshal," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I wish you good evening." After the lawman departed, Genevieve completed her chores mechanically, her mind preoccupied with everything she'd learned. Elias had admitted being in Blake's office the night of the murder. The marshal claimed he had a history as a hired gun. Both could be true, and neither necessarily made him a murderer. As she closed the chicken coop for the night, movement at the edge of her property caught her eye. For a brief, hopeful moment, she thought it might be Elias returning. Instead, she recognized Hank Douglas's stooped figure approaching on horseback, alone and moving unhurriedly. "Evening, Miss Winters," the old rancher called as he drew near. "Thought I might check how you fared with the marshal's visit." Genevieve waited until he had dismounted before responding. "About as well as could be expected. They searched, found nothing, and left with veiled threats." Hank nodded, unsurprised. Donovan's determined, I'll give him that. "Been after Archer for months." He glanced around, confirming they were alone. "Any idea where he's headed?" She hesitated, uncertain how much to trust the Bar d'Etiquette's owner. "He didn't say specifically, just that he had friends in the territory." Hank stroked his silver beard thoughtfully. "Well, if he's smart and Archer's many things, but stupid ain't one of them, he'll head for the high country. Plenty of places up there where a man could disappear until winter forces him down." The concern in her expression must have been evident, because Hank's weathered face softened. "He can take care of himself, Miss Winters. Not the first time Archer's had to lie low, won't be the last." This echoed the marshal's claims about Elias's past, increasing Genevieve's unease. "Mr. Douglas, may I ask you something directly?" "Course," he replied, settling his weight against the corral fence. "Do you believe Elias killed Harrison Blake?" Hank considered the question with the deliberation of a man who didn't speak without thought. "I believe Elias Archer is capable of killing," he said finally. "Seen him do it once, years back, when a group of rustlers hit the AAA. Shot 3 men dead with a precision that spoke of experience." He paused, holding her gaze. "But murder, the calculated kind for money or advantage, no, I don't reckon Archer's built that way." "The marshal seems to think otherwise." "Donovan's got tunnel vision where Archer's concerned," Hank replied with a dismissive gesture. "Been that way since they first crossed paths in Montana territory. Old grudges die hard out here." Genevieve absorbed this new piece of information. "So there's a history between them," Hank nodded. "Story goes, Archer was riding with a group that robbed a bank in Helena. Donovan was a deputy there, got shot during the attempt. By the time he recovered, the gang had scattered, but he never forgot Archer's face." The old rancher shrugged. "Whether it's true, I can't say for certain, but it would explain the marshal's persistence." The picture of Elias that was emerging was more complex than Genevieve had imagined, filled with contradictions and unanswered questions. A potential outlaw who had become a respected rancher. A man capable of violence who had shown her nothing but gentleness. Someone with a shadowed past who had nevertheless built a legitimate present. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Douglas," she said when he had finished. "Though I'm curious why you'd share this with me, given your history with the AAA." Hank's expression turned wry. "Disputes over water and grazing rights are one thing, Miss Winters. False accusations and vendettas are another." He straightened, preparing to depart. Besides, I've seen how Archer looks at you. Man deserves a chance to explain himself, at least. As he mounted his horse, he added, "The social at the Johnsons' is still happening next week. Folks would welcome your presence regardless of current complications." Genevieve smiled despite her troubled thoughts. "Are you extending an invitation, Mr. Douglas?" "Suppose I am," he acknowledged with a nod. "My Caleb could use the reminder that there's more to life than cattle and feuds, and you could use a day away from this place, I'd wager." After he rode away, Genevieve stood watching the stars appear one by one in the deepening twilight. The day had brought revelations she hadn't expected and raised questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Yet beneath her confusion ran a current of certainty. Whatever Elias Archer's past contained, whatever mistakes or misdeeds he might have committed, she had seen enough of his true nature to know he wasn't the villain Donovan painted him to be. The question now was whether he would have the chance to prove that to others, and whether he would return to prove it to her. The Johnson barn raising proved to be the social event of the season, drawing families from across 3 counties to participate in the collective effort and subsequent celebration. Genevieve arrived midday when the framework of the barn was already taking shape against the clear September sky. Dozens of men working in coordinated teams while women prepared an outdoor feast that would feed the assembled crowd. She had debated attending, torn between the desire for community connection and concern about the reception she might receive given recent events. In the end, the need to establish herself as more than the woman from Elias Archer's homestead had decided her. She would face whatever gossip circulated, just as she had in other communities before this one. To her surprise, the welcome she received was genuinely warm. Martha Johnson, a robust woman with a quick laugh and quicker wit, enveloped her in a hug as if they were old friends rather than new acquaintances. "About time you joined us, Miss Winters. We were beginning to think you intended to be a hermit up there on your claim." Genevieve smiled, relaxing slightly at this greeting. "The cabin required my full attention until recently." "So I've heard," Martha replied, her eyes twinkling. "Heard you had some help with it too, though your assistant seems to have made himself scarce lately." So the gossip had indeed spread. Genevieve kept her expression neutral. "Many neighbors have been kind enough to assist me," she said diplomatically. Martha laughed, patting her arm. "No need to be coy, dear. Half the unmarried women in the territory have set their caps for Elias Archer at one time or another. Can't blame him for finally noticing someone with both beauty and backbone." Before Genevieve could formulate a response, Martha whisked her toward the food preparation area, introducing her to a dizzying array of local women. Most greeted her with genuine friendliness, though a few eyed her with the wary calculation she'd come to expect. Hank Douglas's wife Emma, a quiet woman with intelligent eyes, simply nodded in recognition, while Caleb's young wife Sarah offered a shy smile. As the afternoon progressed, Genevieve found herself drawn into the community's rhythms despite her initial reservations. She helped prepare food, learned local names and relationships, and gradually pieced together a more complete understanding of the social landscape she had entered. The Johnsons, it seemed, were neutral territory in the ongoing tensions between various ranching factions, respected by all sides for their fairness and hospitality. By early evening, the barn's main structure stood complete, a testament to collective effort and frontier ingenuity. Tables were laden with food, lanterns were lit as dusk approached, and someone produced a fiddle, signaling the transition from work to celebration. Genevieve was serving herself a portion of Emma Douglas's renowned apple pie when she felt a presence at her elbow. Turning, she found herself face to face with a striking woman, perhaps a few years her senior, dressed in a fashionable gown that seemed out of place among the more practical attire of the other attendees. "You must be the famous Miss Winters," the woman said, her voice cultured and carrying just a hint of condescension. "I've heard so much about you." "I'm afraid you have the advantage," Genevieve replied politely. Mrs. Victoria Blake." The name hung in the air between them, its significance unmistakable. Harrison Blake's widow, Genevieve maintained her composure with effort, acutely aware that nearby conversations had quieted as others noticed this encounter. "My condolences on your loss, Mrs. Blake." Victoria's perfectly arched eyebrow rose slightly. "How diplomatic of you, considering your association with my husband's alleged killer." The direct attack, delivered with such smooth venom, momentarily took Genevieve aback. Before she could respond, Hank Douglas appeared at her side, his weathered face set in lines of disapproval. "Victoria," he greeted the widow with a curt nod. "Didn't expect to see you at a gathering like this. Thought you were planning to return east after Harrison's passing." Victoria's smile remained fixed, though her eyes hardened. "I have unfinished business in the territory, Mr. Douglas, as you well know. The Johnsons invited Miss Winters here as their guest," Hank continued, ignoring her comment. "Proper manners would suggest respecting that, regardless of personal grievances." For a moment, tension crackled between them, then Victoria inclined her head slightly. "Of course, far be it from me to disrupt such a charming event." She turned back to Genevieve. "Perhaps we'll have opportunity to speak more privately another time, Miss Winters. I believe we might have matters of mutual interest to discuss." With that cryptic statement, she glided away, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Genevieve released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Douglas," she said quietly. Hank shook his head, his expression troubled. "Victoria Blake is a dangerous woman in her own right, Miss Winters. More calculating than Harrison ever was, and that's saying something." He nodded toward where she now stood in conversation with the local banker. "She's been lobbying hard for Archer's arrest, offering rewards for information, pressuring the territorial governor." "She seems very certain of his guilt," Genevieve observed. "Too certain," Hank muttered. "Makes a man wonder what she knows that others don't." Before they could discuss the matter further, the fiddle struck up a lively tune and couples began forming for a dance. Caleb Douglas approached, offering his hand to Genevieve with unexpected gallantry. "Miss Winters, would you honor me with this dance? Sarah's resting with the baby, and Pa here claims his dancing days are behind him." Surprised but pleased by the gesture, Genevieve accepted. As they joined the other dancers, Caleb proved to be more graceful than his usual gruff manner suggested. "I owe you an apology," he said after they had completed the first few steps. "I was less than welcoming when you arrived." "You had concerns about a newcomer in contested territory," she replied, understanding his perspective better now than she had initially. "That's not unreasonable," he shook his head. "It wasn't just that. I let old grudges with Archer cloud my judgment about you." The music swelled, and he guided her through a turn before continuing. "Seeing how you've worked that land, built something from nothing well, it reminds me what the territory's supposed to be about, opportunity for those willing to earn it." The unexpected praise warmed her. "Thank you, Mr. Douglas." "Caleb," he corrected with a smile that transformed his normally serious face. "Neighbors should use first names, don't you think?" As the evening progressed, Genevieve found herself passed from partner to partner, dancing with farmers, ranchers, and shopkeepers, who seemed increasingly eager to make the acquaintance of the independent Miss Winters. The attention was flattering, if somewhat overwhelming after months of relative isolation. During a brief respite, she stood at the edge of the makeshift dance floor, watching the swirling couples with a content smile. Martha Johnson appeared beside her, offering a cup of punch. "You've made quite an impression," the older woman observed. "Half the single men here are plotting how to call on you now." Genevieve laughed, accepting the punch gratefully. "I think they're simply curious about the novelty of a woman homesteader." "Perhaps," Martha conceded. "Or perhaps they recognize quality when they see it." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Though I notice you've saved no dances for late arrivals." Before Genevieve could ask what she meant, a murmur spread through the gathered crowd. Heads turned toward the edge of the Johnson property, where a lone rider had appeared, silhouetted against the rising moon. Even at this distance, Genevieve recognized the distinctive outline of Elias's stallion and the man himself, straight-backed and unmistakable even after weeks away. A path cleared as he approached, conversations dying and resuming in hushed tones. Elias dismounted with his usual fluid grace, removed his hat, and nodded respectfully to Matthew Johnson, who stepped forward to greet him. "Archer," the host said, loud enough for all to hear. "Didn't expect to see you tonight." "Hope I'm not intruding, Matt," Elias replied, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I heard there was a gathering, thought I might pay my respects." Johnson glanced around at the watching crowd, then back at his unexpected guest. Whatever he saw in Elias's face must have satisfied him, because he nodded and extended his hand. "Any man willing to show his face in public rather than skulking in the shadows is welcome at my table, even one with a cloud hanging over him." A collective breath seemed to release from the assembly as the two men shook hands. The music, which had faltered at Elias's arrival, resumed tentatively. Some guests returned to their dancing and conversations, though many continued to watch the newcomer with undisguised curiosity. Genevieve remained frozen in place, her heart pounding with emotions too complex to name: relief that he was safe, anger that he had risked appearing publicly, joy at seeing him again, fear for what might happen next. Elias's eyes scanned the crowd until they found her, and the smile that spread across his face then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm, brilliant, transformative. He began moving toward her, pausing briefly to exchange greetings with those who didn't shy away from his approach. Martha Johnson, watching this tableau unfold with obvious delight, squeezed Genevieve's arm encouragingly. "Seems you won't need to save that dance after all," she whispered before tactfully withdrawing. When Elias finally stood before her, Genevieve found herself speechless, drinking in the sight of him like a traveler too long in the desert. He looked leaner than when he'd left, his face more weathered from exposure to the elements, but his eyes remained the same clear, direct, and now filled with an emotion that made her breath catch. "I believe you promised to save me a dance," he said softly, extending his hand. She found her voice at last. "You're taking a terrible risk coming here," she admonished, even as she placed her hand in his. "Some things are worth the risk," he replied simply, leading her toward the dance floor as the fiddle player began a waltz. As they moved together to the music, the rest of the gathering seemed to recede into a distant blur. Elias was an unexpectedly graceful dancer, guiding her with the same confident assurance he brought to everything. "You shouldn't have come," Genevieve murmured, though her body betrayed her words by drawing closer to his. "The marshal is camped 15 miles from here, following a false trail my friends laid," Elias interrupted with a hint of satisfaction. "By the time he realizes his mistake, I'll be long gone." "Then why risk appearing in public at all?" she pressed, his expression softened, the teasing light in his eyes giving way to something deeper, more vulnerable. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of you believing what they're saying about me. Of you thinking I'd abandoned you to face the gossip alone." The raw honesty in his voice touched something in Genevieve that had been walled off for years, a capacity for trust she'd thought permanently damaged by past betrayals. "I never believed you killed Blake," she said quietly. "But there are other things, rumors about your past in Montana, your history with Donovan." Elias nodded, his expression grave. "Most of it's true or true enough. I rode with a rough crowd after the war, did things I'm not proud of. The bank in Helena, I was there, though I never fired a shot." He paused as they turned through the waltz. "I've been trying to outrun that past for years, build something honest with the AAA, thought I'd managed it until Blake's murder brought it all back to the surface. Why didn't you tell me before?" "I was afraid," he admitted, the confession clearly difficult for a man of his pride. "Afraid of seeing that look in your eyes, the one I've seen in so many others when they learn what I was. The look that says no matter what I've built, no matter how I've changed, I'll always be just another outlaw who got lucky." Genevieve studied his face, seeing beyond the handsome features to the complex man beneath one who had made mistakes, perhaps grave ones, but who had also shown her nothing but honesty, respect, and gentle consideration since the day they met. You see that look now?" she asked softly. His gaze searched hers, finding only acceptance where he had feared judgment. The relief that washed over his features was so profound it made her heart ache. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I see the woman who's brought more light into my life in a few months than I'd found in years before." They continued to dance in silence, both aware that this moment of connection existed in a fragile bubble that reality would soon pierce. Around them, the social continued, but Genevieve noticed the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations. Elias's appearance had created a stir that wouldn't quickly subside. As the music drew to a close, Elias reluctantly loosened his hold on her. "I should go," he said, though everything in his expression conveyed his desire to stay. "Being seen with me only complicates things for you." Before she could respond, a commotion at the edge of the gathering caught their attention. Victoria Blake stood there, her face flushed with either anger or triumph, pointing directly at Elias while speaking urgently to a group of men Genevieve didn't recognize. "Trouble," Elias murmured, his posture shifting subtly into alertness. The men began moving toward them with purpose, hands hovering near weapons. Elias positioned himself slightly in front of Genevieve, a protective gesture that she both appreciated and resented. "Elias Archer," called the lead man, a hard-faced individual with a silver star pinned to his vest. "I'm Deputy Wells from the Territorial Marshal's office. I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Harrison Blake." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people drew back, creating a cleared space around the confrontation. Matthew Johnson stepped forward, his expression concerned. "This is a social gathering, Deputy," he said firmly, "not a place for arrests and accusations." "My apologies for the disruption, Mr. Johnson," Wells replied, not sounding particularly apologetic. "But the law doesn't recognize social niceties when it comes to murderers." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level when he spoke. "I'm not a murderer, Wells, and I'm getting tired of the accusation." "That's for a judge to decide," the deputy countered. "Now, are you coming peacefully, or do we need to do this the hard way?" The tension in the air was palpable, the gathered crowd watching with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Genevieve felt her heart racing, torn between urging Elias to comply for his own safety and supporting his resistance against what increasingly seemed like a vendetta rather than justice. Before either man could make a move, another voice cut through the silence, calm, authoritative, unexpected. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding, gentlemen." Hank Douglas stepped into the cleared space, positioning himself between Elias and the deputies. "Mr. Archer couldn't have murdered Harrison Blake on the night in question because he was at the Bar D until well past midnight. Helping deliver a breech calf from my prize heifer." Stunned silence followed this declaration. Elias himself looked as surprised as anyone, staring at the old rancher with undisguised astonishment. "You never mentioned this before, Douglas," Deputy Wells said suspiciously. "Wasn't asked," Hank replied with a shrug. Marshal Donovan seemed convinced he already had his man, didn't see the point in confusing him with facts. "You expect us to believe that Archer, a man you've feuded with for years, was at your ranch the night Blake was killed?" Wells's skepticism was evident in every word. "Don't much care what you believe," Hank retorted, "but my wife, son, and 3 hands can confirm it. Archer brought over a specialized tool for the delivery one he'd acquired during his time in Montana. Saved the calf and the heifer both." Emma Douglas stepped forward, her quiet presence commanding attention. "It's true," she said simply. "Mr. Archer stayed until the birth was complete, then left around 1 in the morning. The calf we named him Lucky is still in our north pasture if you'd care to see him." The deputy looked confounded by this unexpected testimony. Victoria Blake pushed her way forward, face contorted with fury. "They're lying," she hissed. "All of them." The witness saw Archer leaving Blake's office covered in blood. "That would be difficult," Emma continued in her calm way, "considering he was covered in birthing fluid at our ranch at the time your husband was killed." She turned to the assembled crowd. "Many of you have seen Lucky. Born that night, distinctive white blaze on his forehead just like his sire." Murmurs of confirmation rippled through the gathering. Several ranchers nodded, apparently familiar with the calf in question. Deputy Wells looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This contradicts our witness statement directly. Then perhaps your witness is mistaken," Hank suggested, "or lying." Victoria's face had gone pale with rage. "This is absurd. You've hated Harrison for years, Douglas. Why would anyone believe you'd protect his killer?" "I've had my differences with Blake and with Archer both," Hank acknowledged. "But I've never been a man who'd see another hang for a crime he didn't commit, especially not when the real killer might still be walking free." His gaze, when it settled on Victoria, was pointed enough to draw gasps from those close enough to observe the exchange. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. The widow took an involuntary step backward. "How dare you?" she whispered, but there was fear beneath her outrage now. Wells looked between the opposing parties, clearly recognizing that the situation had shifted dramatically. "I'll need to consult with Marshal Donovan before proceeding," he said finally. "Mr. Archer, I'd advise you to remain available for questioning." "I'm not going anywhere, Deputy," Elias replied, his voice steady though Genevieve could sense the tension thrumming through him. "This is my home, and I'm tired of being driven from it by false accusations." As the deputies withdrew, taking a visibly shaken Victoria Blake with them, the social gradually resumed its normal rhythm, though the excitement of the confrontation added a charged energy to the proceedings. Elias turned to Hank Douglas, extending his hand with uncharacteristic hesitance. "I don't know why you did that," he said quietly, "but I'm grateful." Hank accepted the handshake, his weathered face inscrutable. "Don't go thinking this makes us friends, Archer. I still think you're the most stubborn, troublesome neighbor a man could ask for." A smile tugged at the corner of Elias's mouth. "High praise coming from you. Just evening the scales a bit," the older man continued. "Something didn't sit right about Blake's death from the beginning. Too convenient for some, too inconvenient for others." He glanced in the direction Victoria had gone, started asking questions of my own these past weeks. Turns out the widow stood to inherit controlling interest in the Blake holdings only if Harrison died before their 5th anniversary, which was a week after his murder. Genevieve inhaled sharply at this revelation. "You think she arranged her husband's death?" "I think," Hank said carefully, "that Victoria Blake has been very eager to see anyone else take the blame, and I think her witness might have more connection to her than the law currently realizes." Elias absorbed this information with a grim expression. "That's a serious accusation, Hank. Which is why I haven't made it publicly," the rancher replied. "Yet, but Marshal Donovan will be hearing some interesting information when he returns to town information that might shift his focus considerably." After Hank moved away to rejoin his wife, Elias turned to Genevieve, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "I never expected that," he admitted. "Hank Douglas, of all people, providing me with an alibi, a true alibi." She asked quietly, needing to hear the confirmation from him directly. "No," he said honestly. "I was at Blake's office that night, just as I told you, left him alive and angry around 10. He shook his head in wonder. "Which means Hank just committed perjury to protect a man he spent years feuding with." "Why would he do that?" Genevieve mused. "What does he gain?" Elias considered this, his gaze drifting to where Hank stood with Emma, the couple's comfortable familiarity evident in their stance. "Maybe nothing," he said finally. "Or maybe he's just seen enough injustice to recognize it when it appears again. The territorial courts aren't known for their careful deliberation when it comes to men with my background." The fiddle struck up another tune, but neither moved to rejoin the dancing. The night's events had created a turning point, one that required acknowledgement. "What happens now?" Genevieve asked, voicing the question that hung between them. Elias's eyes, when they met hers, held a warmth that made her previous concerns seem distant and inconsequential. "Now I go back to the AAA, rebuild what's been neglected while I've been away." He hesitated, then added more softly, "and hope that my neighbor might be willing to continue our association, despite the complications it's brought her." The careful phrasing didn't disguise the deeper question whether the revelations about his past had changed her feelings, whether she still wanted him in her life now that she knew the full measure of the trouble that followed him. Genevieve considered her response carefully, aware that they stood at a crossroads. The practical choice would be to maintain distance, to focus on her homestead and let the dust settle around Elias's situation before entangling herself further. The safe choice. But safety had never been what drew her west, had never been what made her heart race when Elias Archer appeared on her horizon. "I believe," she said finally, a smile spreading across her face, "that we were in the middle of a dance when we were interrupted." The relief and joy that transformed his expression was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. As they rejoined the other dancers, moving together in perfect synchronization, Genevieve finally understood what had drawn her to this man from the beginning, not despite the trouble that surrounded him, but because of how he faced it with courage, integrity, and an unwavering sense of his own truth. Just as she had always tried to face her own. The first snow of winter dusted the mountains in late October, a gentle warning of the harsher weather to come. Genevieve stood on her cabin porch, watching the distant peaks turn white while closer at hand. Autumn's golden light bathed her homestead in a warm glow. In the months since the Johnson social, her property had transformed from a rudimentary shelter to a genuine home, snug, well-provisioned, and increasingly reflective of her personality. The cabin now boasted proper windows with glass panes, curtains sewn from fabric purchased in timberline, and furniture both practical and beautiful. A stone pathway connected the main building to the well-constructed barn where Ruby and the other animals would shelter during winter storms. The root cellar was stocked with vegetables from her first modest harvest, supplemented by generous gifts from neighbors who had gradually accepted her as part of their community. Most importantly, the land office had conducted its final inspection and approved her claim. The official document confirming her ownership had arrived the previous week, the culmination of months of labor and determination. Her homestead was legally hers, 160 acres of promise, permanently recorded in the territorial registry. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled her from contemplation. She smiled, recognizing the distinctive rhythm of Elias's stallion even before rider and horse appeared around the bend in the trail. In the weeks since his name had been cleared of Blake's murder, his visits had resumed with increasing frequency, each one lingering longer than the last. Victoria Blake had fled the territory following the revelation that her star witness had been her lover for years before Harrison's death, a man with gambling debts that had mysteriously vanished shortly after the murder. Marshal Donovan, faced with mounting evidence of the widow's involvement and the collapse of his case against Elias, had reluctantly shifted his investigation. Last Genevieve had heard, Victoria was being sought by authorities in Denver regarding her husband's estate and suspicious financial transactions. Elias dismounted with his usual grace, securing his horse before approaching the porch with long, confident strides. He carried a burlap sack that appeared to contain several packages. "Afternoon, neighbor," he greeted her, his smile warming his eyes to that particular shade of blue that never failed to quicken her pulse. "Thought you might appreciate some supplies from town." "Always," she replied, returning his smile as she moved aside to let him enter the cabin. "Though I'm beginning to think you use deliveries as an excuse for these visits." He set the sack on her table, removing his hat and coat with the comfortable familiarity of a frequent guest. "Do I need an excuse?" he asked, quirking an eyebrow in challenge. "Not in the slightest," Genevieve admitted, enjoying the way his expression softened at her answer. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the autumn months, each visit deepening their understanding of one another, each conversation revealing new layers of compatibility and shared values. The physical attraction that had simmered between them from the beginning had matured into something more profound, a connection rooted in mutual respect and genuine affection. Yet neither had pushed for formal definition of what they were becoming to each other. There were practical considerations, two properties to maintain, her need for independence, his lingering concerns about his reputation affecting her standing in the community. And beneath those, perhaps, a shared caution born of past wounds neither had fully revealed to the other. Elias began unpacking his deliveries: coffee, sugar, ammunition for her rifle, several books she'd expressed interest in, and a small package wrapped in brown paper tied with string. "What's this?" she asked, picking up the mysterious parcel. "Open it and see," he suggested, watching her with an intensity that made her curious about its contents. Untying the string, she carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box beautifully crafted from polished cherry wood. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a delicate silver pendant, a miniature representation of a cabin with tiny windows that caught the light, suspended on a fine chain. "Elias," she breathed, lifting the necklace from its box. "It's beautiful." "Had it made in Cheyenne," he explained, a hint of nervousness beneath his usual confidence. "Thought it might commemorate your accomplishment, the homestead officially becoming yours." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. Not jewelry for its own sake, but a meaningful symbol of what she had worked so hard to achieve, evidence that he truly understood what this land, this independence meant to her. "Thank you," she said, holding the pendant toward him. "Would you help me put it on?" He stepped behind her, carefully draping the chain around her neck and securing the clasp. His fingers lingered briefly at her nape, a gentle touch that sent warmth cascading through her. When he moved to face her again, his expression had grown more serious. "There's something I wanted to discuss with you, Genevieve." "That sounds ominous," she remarked, trying to keep her tone light despite the sudden flutter of anxiety his words provoked. He smiled, but his eyes remained intent. "Not ominous, at least I hope not." He took a deep breath as if gathering his thoughts. "Winter's coming on, the high country's already seeing heavy snow, and the old-timers are predicting a hard season ahead." She nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "I've been preparing." "The barn's secure, the woodpile stacked, provisions stored." "I know you have," he acknowledged. "You're more capable than anyone I've ever met, but even the most capable person faces challenges during a Wyoming winter, especially alone," understanding dawned. "You're concerned about my welfare." "I'm concerned about many things," he admitted. "Your safety, yes, but also—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I find myself increasingly distracted from my own work, thinking about you up here, wondering if you're well, if you need anything. Wanting to be here rather than at the AAA." Genevieve felt a curious mixture of emotions at this confession, pleasure at his concern, a touch of defensiveness at the implication she couldn't manage alone, and beneath both, a growing anticipation of what he might be working toward. "What are you suggesting, Elias?" she asked directly. He met her gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting that we stop pretending these visits are merely neighborly, that we acknowledge what's been growing between us since that first day in Timberline." Her heart accelerated at his directness. "And what exactly do you think has been growing between us?" A smile tugged at his lips. "The kind of trouble neither of us seems able to resist." His expression sobered. "The kind worth facing together rather than apart." She waited, sensing he had more to say. "I love you, Genevieve," he said simply, the words hanging in the air between them like something precious and fragile. "I think I have since I saw you hold your ground behind that water trough, facing down deputies without flinching." The declaration, though not entirely unexpected given the direction of their relationship, still took her breath away. No man had spoken those words to her since St. Louis, since the disaster that had driven her west in the first place. "Elias," she began, but he raised a hand to gently interrupt. "You don't need to answer now," he assured her, "or in the same way, I just needed you to know where I stand." He reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a folded document. "This is what I really came to discuss." Curious, she accepted the paper. Unfolding, it revealed a legal transfer of property from the AAA ranch to Genevieve Winters. According to the document, Elias was signing over 50 acres of his land that adjoined her property to the east, including a year-round spring and valuable timber stands. I don't understand, she said, confusion overriding her emotional response to his earlier confession. Why would you do this? Because it's rightfully yours, he replied. That parcel was part of the original homestead claim you filed, but Blake's influence had it redrawn to favor the triple before you arrived. I didn't realize until I examined the land office records after Victoria's departure. Genevieve stared at the deed, processing this revelation. So you're returning what should have been mine from the beginning, he nodded. With no strings attached, whether or not you return my feelings, whether or not you want me in your life beyond today, that land is yours by right. The gesture spoke volumes about the man standing before her, his integrity, his fairness, his willingness to correct an injustice even at personal cost. It also, she realized, represented his profound understanding of what mattered most to her, her independence, her right to determine her own path. There's something else you should know, he continued when she remained silent. I've been considering changes at the AAA. It's more land than one man needs, especially one who finds himself increasingly drawn to his neighbor's company. What kind of changes? She asked, her mind racing ahead to possibilities she scarcely dared consider. I'm thinking of selling the northern section, about 2/3 of the current ranch. Keep enough for a modest operation, something more compatible with other priorities. The implication was clear. He was willing to reshape his life, to alter the empire he'd built, in order to create space for her within it, without asking her to abandon what she had worked so hard to achieve. Genevieve placed the deed carefully on the table, then moved closer to Elias, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw as he awaited her response. When we met, she began slowly, people warned me you'd bring trouble. That your reputation, your past, would somehow taint anyone associated with you. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his cheek with gentle fingers. What they didn't understand is that trouble had already found me, long before I met you. The difference is, facing it alone left me cold, facing it with you makes trouble worth having, he suggested, a hopeful smile beginning to form. Makes life worth living, she corrected, rising on tiptoes to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened as Elias wrapped his arms around her, drawing her close with a tenderness that belied his strength. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, his eyes shone with emotion. Is that a yes? He asked, his voice husky. To what? She teased. You haven't actually asked me anything yet, he laughed, the sound rich with joy and relief. Fair point, let me remedy that immediately. Taking her hands in his, he grew serious once more. Genevieve Winters, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not to merge our properties or simplify our arrangements, but because I love you and cannot imagine a future that doesn't have you at the center of it. The answer formed in her heart long before it reached her lips. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Elias Archer, I will marry you. Because I love you to your principles, your kindness, your willingness to face trouble head-on instead of running from it, just as I've tried to do. His smile then was like sunrise breaking over her land, brilliant, warming, full of promise for what the day might bring. As he pulled her into another embrace, Genevieve reflected that perhaps the rumors had been right all along. She did bring trouble to any man who got close to her. But they'd been wrong about one crucial detail. With the right man, trouble wasn't something to fear or avoid. With Elias Archer, trouble was just another name for the life they would build together, challenging, unpredictable, and infinitely more rewarding than the safe path either of them might have chosen alone. They were married on Christmas Day in the Johnsons' front parlor, a small ceremony attended by those neighbors who had become friends over the preceding months. Hank and Emma Douglas stood as witnesses, the old rancher gruffly admitting that Elias could have done worse when asked for his blessing on the union. Winter settled over the territory with the predicted ferocity, but found the newly wedded couple well prepared. They divided their time between the homestead and the AAA's main house, gradually integrating their operations while maintaining the separate identities of both properties. The northern section of Elias's ranch sold quickly to a cattle consortium from Colorado, providing capital for improvements to the remaining land and Genevieve's homestead alike. By spring's thaw, they had established a rhythm that honored both his experience in ranching and her vision for the homestead. Together, they expanded her garden into a proper farm, built additional outbuildings, and increased their combined herds with careful selection for quality rather than quantity. Word spread throughout the territory of their partnership's success and of the fierce independence they maintained even within marriage. Other women homesteaders began appearing in the region, some seeking Genevieve's advice, others simply drawing inspiration from her example. Elias, far from being threatened by his wife's growing reputation, took evident pride in introducing himself as Genevieve Winters' husband when they attended territorial functions. The following December, as another winter closed in around them, Genevieve gave birth to twins, a boy and girl with their father's eyes and their mother's copper hair. Standing by the cabin window with their son in his arms while Genevieve nursed their daughter, Elias gazed out at the snow-covered landscape that had become their shared domain. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, the question encompassing all they had built together in the year since their wedding. Genevieve looked up from their daughter's face, taking in the sight of her husband with their son, the man they had once warned her would bring nothing but trouble, now the center of a family she had never dared to dream possible. "Not a single one," she replied with absolute certainty. "Every bit of trouble was worth this." Elias smiled, crossing the room to sit beside her on the bed, their children cradled between them. "Then trouble's still my middle name," he said, leaning in to kiss her forehead, "and always will be as long as you're by my side." As snow continued to fall beyond their window, blanketing their land in pristine white, Genevieve Winters Archer knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found what she had always sought. Not an absence of trouble, but the courage to face it alongside someone who valued her strength as much as she valued his. Together, they had transformed the warnings that had followed them both into the foundation of something rare and precious, a love built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that the most worthwhile journeys were seldom the easiest ones. And in the warmth of their cabin, with their children sleeping peacefully between them, all the troubles of their past seemed distant and inconsequential compared to the joy they had found in each other's arms.